Okay, as we start to wind through the last of what seems like a terminal set of panels, I'm sure you guys. Nation state and nationalism. Nation state and nationalism are hugely important, especially in the world of 2022. The classic example right now would be Russia, as we'll see, but China is not far behind it. The nation state is when you have a politically bounded area that's independent or sovereign, which for some reason or another has basically decided that that area and the people in that area are actually defined by a particular extent culture, and in some cases by a race. So they're using the race or ethnicity definition, but most importantly, they're using this idea of culture. So for example, in Russia, the only real Russians, in quotes, would be those who are part of Russian cultural ethos. If you're not part of that group, then it doesn't matter if you're in Russia, you're not really a true Russian. This starts up, you'd have to ask Mitch or Frank or someone. I'm not sure when you want to define this as starting up. In Europe, it picks up steam in the 1700s. And basically, if you think the United States is one of the first examples, but the French are probably the next. What happens is, especially in the 19th century, is whereas identity in most of Europe and other places was identified by the ruler. So it might be an individual, it might be a ruling family or whatever. So basically the country or the state, the nation, is defined by its head of state. In fact, that's why that term comes from. And so if you were in France prior to the French Revolution, the Louis XIV or whichever Louis was the king at the time, it was his country. In fact, I think one of the Louis actually said once that the country is me and I'm the country. So you'd swear allegiance to that person, and that person was the country. Now, what happens in the 1800s, the British probably do this the first, but I don't think they really think it through very much, is that there's an enormous shift. And what happens is, whereas an individual or a family was the defining, owner, if you would, of a country, that gets replaced by a group. And the group would be basically the culture. So the French Revolution was basically the removal of the idea of kingship, if you would, and replacing it with the idea that if you're French, it's la Marseillaise and la liberté and all the rest of that, and that makes you French, and the French are the people that run the French state. That's a nation state. So in the 19th century, what happens is most of Europe, most places go through this various forms of political turmoil and dialogue, and the end result is countries get run by groups who identify themselves on a particular set of culturally defined values and attitudes, and that becomes the country. So nation state is the idea that a culture becomes bonded to a particular area, and that then becomes, who you are, and that justifies the country or the nation state. Now, this, of course, gets very complicated. This leads to a lot of trouble because you end up with groups that are part of that culture that aren't in the boundaries of the country. And you could argue that a lot of the wars in the last couple of 100 years have been to basically, expand the boundaries of your countries to swallow up everyone who is part of your culture. And at the same time, of course, you can sort of conveniently ignore the other folks in that same area that aren't. The Russian, games that they're playing in the eastern Ukraine. The minority population there were actually Russians that were sent over by Stalin back in the 1940s at gunpoint, but they settled there and, they became a minority population of what is the Ukraine, which is an entirely different cultural group. A couple of years ago, the Russians decided, as part of this Russian nationalism, we'll see in some of the videos you guys watch, part of the definition of that became the idea that everyone who is Russian should be within the boundaries of the state of Russia. And so rather than moving the people, what you do is you sort of conveniently expand the boundaries. And that's why the Eastern Ukraine now, as far as Russia is concerned, is part of Russia. As far as everyone else is concerned, Russia took it. But as far as Russia is concerned, it's Russia, because some of the people in there are part of their culture, and therefore they're going to move the boundaries out to swallow them up. Now, of course, the scary part is there's Russians all the way through the Ukraine and even further west. And the Russian premise is that, they've actually said formally under Putin that everyone who is Russian in culture should be part of the state of Russia, which means they leave themselves the rights to expand their boundaries to swallow up everyone who's a member of the group. Which gets everyone else pretty hyperactive. So that's the definition of nation state. You can argue again, the last couple 100 years, almost all the wars that have occurred have been defined by nation states. Prior to that, wars were defined largely by a combination of religion, in terms of religious conflict, either within a religion or between religions, or People in charge that just felt like it's Thursday, I want to go beat up on my neighbor, and kings decide to go after each other. That was the way it used to be. In the 19th and 20th century, it became nation state. And probably the ugliest example of this would be Nazi Germany, where you basically decide that anyone who isn't an acceptable part of your race and culture, you're going to genocide. And one of the terrifying things about nation states is that makes it a very logical frame of reference if you're doing that. Myanmar is going through that right now. You get rid of everyone who's not part of your culture group, because as far as you're concerned, they shouldn't live in your country. And you give them two choices. They either leave or you kill them. And that's the terrifying aspect of nation states. Now, nationalism then is that culture base that defines the state membership. This is an enormous ongoing discussion in the United States and has been for quite a while, but it's really popped up in the last 6 or 10 years with the idea that what culture group is legitimately the group that makes up the United States? Is it Anglo-Europeans? Is it, what is it? And, the United States, one, being a very diverse place, and with the exception of a few folks like my relatives, being folks that basically are all migrants. This is what makes the United States hugely different. The population here is migrant. If you go down to Mexico, a large part of the population has been there for thousands of years, the Azteca, Mixteca, Oaxaca, etc. So they don't have that same discussion. Canada does, but they don't have it quite the same way. But in the United States, it's important to remember that even the folks that are posturing, well, our culture should be it, as by Native American terms, they only got here a few weeks ago. So it makes the United States discussion about nationalism much more, unique, I guess is a polite way to put it, than you would see in some place like Japan or China or, for example, even Russia. So nationalism is basically when you're talking about the culture that defines state membership. And it's oftentimes spun with all sorts of things. And again, going back to ethnicity, can be based on language, can be based on looks, can be, you name it, religion, pick your flavor of the week. But that's nationalism. And it is the key component that's driving a lot of the enormous stress that we're going through right now in the early parts of 2022, is the idea of nation states and nationalism defining the way they're going to treat the world around them, most specifically Russia and the People's Republic of China. Social structures. This should be pretty straightforward. There's basically most of the world exists in some sort of a class system where basically, depending on your socioeconomic status, maybe your ethnicity or whatever, you have differential access. And those vary tremendously from place to place, group to group in terms of how that access plays out. In a few places, and this would be true of, for example, conservative Hindu sections of India, you actually have caste systems still in place, which basically the group that you're born into at birth limits your options to whatever the sort of, packages of that group, and you're not allowed to move around. So it's a much more constrained system. In fact, sort of your role in life as caste at birth might be a way to think of that. The other social structures becoming a bigger and bigger issue in the early 21st century is gender. The two basic genders, male and female, but also other gender groups, and how they fit into this whole large system. And again, this varies tremendously from group to group, religious base to religious base, ethnicity to ethnicity. So the key thing to remember with social structures is they vary tremendously. All groups have them, all places have them, but there's not some sort of common pattern you're going to find in all of them. Demographics are going to be a huge part of what we talk about this semester. A lot of the world is going through enormous demographic change. Most famously would be places like Italy, Russia itself. Japan probably is the stereotype that's brought up all the time, but China's going through this in a huge panic about this right now. Demographics are basically how many people you have and where they are, and to a certain extent also, of course, what age group they are, what gender, etc. CBR just means crude birth rate. CDR means crude death rate. TFR is the really key one. This is total fertility rate. The text talks about this, but total fertility rates is the one that's really critical right now, because a lot of your more economically successful countries are ending up in situations where their birth rate is not equaling their death rate. So the population is actually shrinking. In Japan's case, it's pretty radical. I think Italy might be the worst, but I don't really keep track of it. They're both sort of neck and neck. So every day, every week, every month, there's fewer Italians and fewer Japanese than there were the month before. And most importantly is that the number of people in different age groups is shrinking. So Japan right now is very famously, I think at 23%, I could be wrong, 23% of the population is over 65 years of age, which is an enormous part when you think about it. You guys aren't in that age group, but if you think about it, that means that if you were in a society like that, there'd be very few folks in the age group of say 20 to 40 who'd be the ones generating the income. And of course, among other things, you're going to have to pay the medical services and social services to keep a rapidly aging population around. Japan, by I think 2 years from now, is going to be up to 25% of the population over 65. And you see this if you go to rural Japan. You go to rural Japan, you can find whole villages, basically almost ghost towns, except for, you know, little 1,000-year-old ladies wandering around, and that's it. Everyone else is in the cities. And then, in fact, there's a whole thing which you might get into when you get to Japan of dealing with abandoned houses and abandoned villages, because so much of the population is old, can't care for themselves anymore. And, you know, this is a huge problem in a bunch of societies. In American society, it's also complicated because the sort of what you might call the Anglo-American part of the population, especially the Anglo-European part, is actually shrinking in population pretty quickly. Other migratory groups that have moved into the United States are increasing. So folks that would be technically Latinos are an increasing population, not only in terms of total numbers, but more importantly in percentage. African Americans are actually dropping. So the number of African Americans, like Anglo Americans, is actually starting to shrink in the population. And this, of course, leads to a whole set, again, of political and social stresses attached to it. So demographics is going to be a big issue in many societies. It's literally the front page thing, even with COVID. Demographics are at least as important, or not more important, the way to see things. Last of these, migration. Migration, you know, again, we're going to see this as one of the motive patterns you find in almost everywhere. Migration occurs in basically sort of 2.5 forms. Migration, of course, just means someone moving from one group to another group, or more accurately, moving from one place to another place. Here in Hawaii, we actually see 2 of these systems much more frequently do, for example, a lot of the rest of the United States. In a lot of the rest of the United States, migration is actually just individuals or families just getting up and going somewhere. In fact, many Americans, I think on average, still Americans live in their particular house for about under 5 years, and then they move somewhere else, which Europeans or most of the rest of the world just find is surreal. But that's just because Americans just, you know, we're just a migratory group. I mean, most of those folks migrated to the United States, and when they got here, they just go around like the steel balls in a pachinko game. Chain migration, we see a lot of that here. This is especially true of Pacific Islanders. One member of a family or a group comes here. Once they've set up shop and got established and figure out how the game works, other members of the family come over. So think of links in a chain. So eventually you end up with a proportion of the family here, which is actually a very clever strategy, because what it means is the new folks coming over have someone here who could basically, you know, show them the ropes on how to adapt, how to get by, can give them a place to stay till they get it figured out. Chain migration is extremely common here in Hawaii. The other one that we see a lot, and this is especially true, for example, the Filipinos, especially Tagalogs here from Luzon, is what we call circular migration. And that's where someone comes over here, maybe, say they come over here and they become a nurse or some sort of health practitioner. They come over here, work here for 20 or 30 years. But they always go back and visit home. They keep contact with home. In many cases, including a friend of mine, for example, she actually sent money back home, so they actually built her a retirement house. So about 3 years ago, she was, in her late 50s. She'd saved up enough money. She was, content with where she was, and she left and went back to Luzon. So in that situation, we call it circular migration, because the person in that migration has no intention of being here forever. The home is still where they're from. And so you're somewhere else, usually where economically the conditions are better. And you basically, keep your ties with the home area, and eventually you go home. So it literally is a circle. Notice how it's different than chain. Chain's permanent, it's just linked. Diaspora is when you get a large chunk of a population, for whatever reason, just decides to pack up and move, or else they're forced to move. A good example, and probably the best example in the United States, would be the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, moving from, I think it was Kansas, I can't remember exactly where, somewhere in the Midwest. The low level of tolerance in the Midwest for different religious groups meant that they were in a huge amount of trouble. They were getting lynched and all sorts of stuff like that. And so basically, they just collectively decided as a group to just, the vast majority of them just literally packed up and moved out west to Utah. So that's a diaspora. Diasporas are usually based either on ethnicity and or religion. Now, the terrifying thing is you also get diasporas where it's intentional, in the sense that they're forced to leave. And this would be, again, Myanmar right now. Your mountain populations in the western part of Myanmar have been told by the government, get your ass out of here. We don't care where you go, but you're not going to be here anymore. So that's a combination of a nation state can trigger a diaspora. And these would be called refugees. Refugees would be there. That's what we see in places like Syria. Sad to say, refugees are actually, I believe there's a larger number in terms of actual total numbers now than there have been since World War II. And a refugee means that basically when someone's a refugee, it's not the same as migration. In migration, I might be from from American Samoa, and so I'm here, but I've got links with family. Family is still home. Family comes over here. I go back and visit them once in a while. I might be here forever, but I've still got people back where I'm from, you might say. In a refugee situation, that's gone. If you're a Syrian refugee living in Paris, it's a good bet that you not only know where anyone else from your village is from, is if they're still alive. You might even know how much of your family is still alive. Your entire ties with that country are gone. Your entire ties with that group are gone. You might be the only person in that group. And as far as you know, you're an isolated individual, and everything that has been destroyed. Last time we faced this in large numbers in the United States would be the Vietnamese and Southeast Asian refugees that came over here at the aftermath of the Vietnam War. So refugees aren't migrants. Refugees are sort of a subset of, well, I guess they're a subset of migrants, but they're different because they've lost everything. Family, village, cultural ties, everything is gone. And this makes them very difficult to work with. If you ever talk to folks like folks in the United Nations or some of these guys, the East West Center, that specialize in refugees, it's incredible when you think about it. It's incredibly hard to get refugees to be motivated, because if I'm dealing with refugees in Paris, for example, those Syrian refugees don't want to be in Paris. They don't want to be in France. Most of them actually want to still be in their village back home, but that's not an option that's available to them. That's now been destroyed. Their entire world's been burned. And that makes them very unmotivated to learn French, and makes them very unmotivated to have anything to do with French society. And basically a lot of their conversation will be about home, but home doesn't exist anymore. And this makes them a really gut-wrenching group to deal with. It also makes them a very hard group to assimilate into in society, because they're oftentimes very bitter about where they are. And the Syrians are like this. When they look at the French, they're sort of like, well, why didn't you step in militarily and stop that stuff before we got all wiped out? Where the hell were you when we needed you? So they're not going to necessarily be all happy and really stoked that you let them stay in your country. In many cases, they're going to be really bitter about it, especially if it's from their standpoint, you had the power to make sure that this horrible situation never occurred. So refugees are a particular phenomenon. They're a huge phenomenon, sad to say, in the world of 2022. And we do a very poor job of dealing with them, because I think most people tend to think of refugees as migrants, and they're not. There's an enormous world of difference between a refugee and someone who's a regular migrant. Lastly, very quickly, politics. One of the issues that you find in them, actually sort of two related issues you find in the 21st century, of our period, the 2020s, is one is that, interestingly enough, nation states are starting to collapse as entities. What's happening is the idea of nationalism, a culture defining a country or a state, is being in large part replaced with ethnicity. More and more, and this includes the censuses that we have in the United States, more and more Americans identify themselves with their ethnic group than they do with the nation culture. This is hugely the case in most societies. This causes an enormous amount of stress and trouble in a lot of countries, where people demand that their particular ethnicity be the measure by which they're judged in political control. That's what you find with Catalonia, for example, in Spain. That population is totally unimpressed with being Spanish. Their view is Catalonia is its own country. They speak their own version dialect of Spanish, and as far as they got their own attitudes and values, and they should be a nation state. This is a huge discussion in a lot of the world in 2022. Is what makes up a country? Who should have sovereignty? And oftentimes it's defined, now by ethnicity, which traditional places like the United States or Spain or France have a really hard time with. Not surprised, I should say, a lot of folks do. The other thing that's popped up in the late 20th, but especially in the 21st century, is non-governmental organizations that have all sorts of power. The classic example would be the World Bank, which basically controls a large amount of the world's economic finances moving around the planet. There's other regional organizations. The United Nations is a good example. On one hand, it's a group of nation states together. On the other hand, it has its own, sort of agendas and principles. Regional unions, the European Union is a good case in point. And as we'll get into, this is why the Brits left it. The renegotiated, whatever the post-NAFTA is, and I can remember the acronym here for the United States, Canada, Mexico, is again a regional union. So it's not part of the nation state, it's something larger. Now, of course, the other thing, and this is very much the 21st century, is we have non-governmental organizations. Greenpeace, Oxfam, Amnesty International. In other words, groups that are based on agendas or issues, but they don't see themselves as part of a country. This is very much a 21st century thing, and they become increasingly powerful, especially with the growth of the internet and social media, which means that you can basically mobilize a large group of people, in all sorts of diverse places because of a particular issue. You can get them all agitated about it. Black Lives Matter would be a real good example in the United States. In fact, actually out in Europe also, based on, non-governmental discussions about, how people should be treated. So all of these are very much new. You go back 40 years ago, and none of this would have even been on the plate in terms of what people were thinking about might happen. But now they've become an absolutely central part of this whole discussion of who people are and what they are. So very quickly, let's just bust off the last part of this, because this again is really clear, I think. When looking at economic systems, we tend to use four terms. Primary means that you're actually a place that generates something. So for example, Australia generates an enormous amount of meat that it exports. It also generates enormous amounts of copper and other minerals that it exports. So that means that a large part of the Australian economy is actually what we call a primary economy. They're generating resources that other places consume. A secondary economy, the best example right now would be the Chinese economy. Stuff shipped in from other parts of the world. In China, it's turned into clothes or iPhones or whatever. So if you want to, your factories and production centers and that's where that economic system generates its income, and that's China. They're the world's great secondary or production center on the planet right now. Tertiary is basically what we call service sector. Hawaii is a good example of a tertiary economy. We don't generate anything here. We have no natural resources that we really export. We don't have anything that we make here. All we do is we provide services. And Chaminade's a good example. We provide educational services. Waikiki provides tourism services. The Japanese economy is almost entirely a tertiary economy. It's a service-driven sector, which is one reason why when COVID hits, these places get hammered, because if you don't have any people, who are you going to sell the services to? Quaternary is the fourth of these, and this would be basically command and control. So these are the folks that make decisions about the other groups. So, boards of major corporations, where those corporations exist, banking systems and all that type of stuff, those would be quaternary. That's the United States, and to a lesser extent, maybe the Japanese economy somewhat. A lot of their money is actually generated, for example, from the New York Stock Exchange and stuff moving around. That's actually from global positions, but it's all that investment and all that money happens in New York and San Francisco. So that's the quaternary economy. Economic systems, anywhere you are some combination of the four. In most areas, they're very much emphasized on one of them. And so when you're looking at from one part of the world and trying to compare it to another world, you've got to be very aware of the economic implications of, how do they basically get the revenue, where they get their stuff from, and how do they pay for it? And we see this measured in what we call GDP, gross domestic product, gross national industry. All these are just basically different words for basically some sort of numerical measure of what you're doing economically and how well you're doing. Free market capitalism is just the idea that you don't have government control, that you just let basically the economics of sort of pragmatic reality decide what's going to happen. So, this was a big discussion about 6 or 8 years ago, where basically a public university should not get tax support, that they should have to compete with private universities in a free market system. The best school wins and the worst school loses. So that's sort of free market capitalism. It's been taken to extremes, especially recently. The rhetoric is always that it's attractive, but the reality is it's not very practical, to be honest, because a large part of your population is going to get screwed over in most societies. Command economy, that would be Russia and China. China's probably the best example, where basically the government actually controls almost everything. So the government controls the stock market, the government controls how much money you can invest, the government to a certain extent even controls what type of job you can have. So basically the government is sort of like Big Brother, basically says, okay, this is what's going to happen. It's like the obverse of free market capitalism. MNC won't worry about that. Outsourcing, you guys see it all the time. That's where you basically go somewhere else because you can get it cheaper. So for example, if you call because you're having troubles with Microsoft or some other product, you're very likely going to be at a call center in India. Why? Because the technicians in India, you can pay them a lot less to get the same answer than someone, say, in the United States. That's called outsourcing. Again, you've heard it all the time. Last and sort of thing to remember about all this is when you're talking about comparing one country or one group to another, oftentimes the thing comes up as quality of life. When we think about that, it's a very complex phenomenon because, for example, it's entirely subjective for one thing. What do you mean by quality of life? And secondly is, of course, who defines it? And then if one group doesn't have as good of quality of life as you have, then who's going to pay for it? At what point should you have a global quality of life where everyone has the same access to stuff? Is that reasonable? Does it make sense? Is it possible? Is it pragmatic? So we'll see this when we get later in the semester, but it becomes one of the discussions that frequently gets brought up. So we just got it here. So that takes us through all the terms. Don't worry about a lot of them. When you hear them, you can probably go back and get them. But most of the terms, should be pretty straightforward anyway. So now we're going to start looking at different regions. We're going to start with Europe.